Hello there, welcome back to the channel, and this episode is on the Trabe. Now, the Trabe were once an incredibly prosperous and very powerful civilization that lived in the area of the Delta Quadrant where Voyager was first deposited by the Caretaker. But by the time Voyager arrived, the Kazon had displaced the Trabe from their top position as sort of top dog in the area. Trabe technology was actually quite primitive, but despite this, numerically and socially, they had spread themselves out quite wide and were very widely respected. Neelix stating that no one was really aware of the Kazon. The Trabe were effectively a race of slavers. They'd enslaved the entire Kazon civilization and kept them as a worker class within their own society. They lived in ghettos and in incredible poverty on Trabe settlements, while the Trabe lived lush, lavish, exorbitant lifestyles. But no one really knew about them. Neelix would point out that no one knew about the Kazon. No one knew what was happening. And even if they did, no one wanted to push it. Again, this region of the Delta Quadrant was pretty selfish, with races kind of looking out for themselves. No one wanted to push it because the Trabe were very powerful, and no one wanted to antagonize them in fear of losing lucrative trade deals and opportunities with the Trabe, as they commanded vast resources. This is reflected in their starships. The Kazon were, in my opinion, used as a labor class, likely in mining, likely in agriculture, and likely in some other more sordid pursuits, but likely as well, considering the Kazon's familiarity with Trabe technology in industry, manufacturing, within factories, shipyards. They probably helped construct, not only extract the raw materials, but construct the raw materials and assemble the starships. I highly doubt the Kazon had anything to do with the development of the ships, but likely helped in building them. This is probably why the Trabe were able to build and field such large and imposing starships, considering their level of technology, because they basically had an entire workforce under thumb that allowed them to be freed up to pursue other things. The Trabe liked to portray themselves as an enlightened and peaceful civilization, but in reality they were one of the worst monsters, in the Kazon's opinion, and quite frankly in a few other races' opinion, in the region. They were devils, they were demons, they were just one of the nastiest races around, but they hid it really well. They were very selfish and quite callous, controlling, again, incredibly powerful, lucrative trade opportunities throughout the region. Their large and imposingly powerful starships gave them an advantage in the region over races, despite their limited technological capabilities. Eventually, though, the Kazon would rise up against them. The Trabe had encouraged the Kazon to fight amongst themselves for generations by this point in order to prevent them doing exactly this, but eventually the Kazon saw through the stupidity of fighting each other when they had a real enemy. The Kazon would unite, rise up, steal the Trabe's technology, and expel them from their homeworld, forcing the Trabe to become a nomadic people. Now, there's some connotations in this that are pretty dark. Assuming the Trabe have a population at a bare minimum in the hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions of Trabe could not fit on their starships. This means the Kazon wiped out most of the Trabe, or countered and enslaved them. But there's no evidence to show that the Kazon had an enslaved, indoctrinated race, so I think more likely they simply wiped out huge numbers of the Trabe population, or decimated it and damaged it so severely. The Trabe were moving around in various convoys, which were floating around the galaxy trying to find and establish themselves a new homeworld, but every time they attempted this, the Kazon would attack them. After more than 30 years, which, by the way, very naively, Voyager and its crew would go, well, it's been more than 30 years and they're not over it. 30 years is far less than a Kazon's lifespan. Cullen alone must have been in his 40s, so he was likely a child when they were enslaved, when his grandfather united the Kazon and overthrew the Trabe. So 30 years is nothing. That's Federation naivete, nothing more. Militarily speaking, the Trabe were very powerful. The Kazon's aversion to uniforms indicating the Trabe had once had a powerful and thriving military, but the Kazon had managed to defeat it and take its weapons and use it against them. They'd also enhanced much of their tactical capabilities, turning the Kazon into a more formidable and more potent military threat than the Trabe ever were. Plus, in a straight combat situation, the Kazon were inherently more aggressive than the Trabe. Despite this, despite their violent history, after a group of Trabe helped Neelix escape from a Kazon prison, they united with Voyager when a particular Trabe called Mabus tricked Janeway into believing that the Trabe wanted peace. Yes, they did want a new stabilized region of space, but like all the races in the local region, they were out for themselves. It was actually the Trabe who were far more against diplomacy and negotiation than even the Kazon. The Kazon were fully willing to sit down at a negotiating table with both the Federation, who they didn't particularly like, and the Trabe, who they hated, as well as with each other, who sometimes they didn't particularly like or even hate. But they were willing to do it to create peace. The Trabe were purely thinking this is our opportunity to either gain the upper hand on the Kazon or send them into such chaos that we'll be able to restore our power and maybe, as the Kazon feared, return and re-enslave them. This was used as nothing but an opportunity by Mabus to set up and get as many of the Kazon First Mages into one room as possible and then send a fighter down to obliterate them. Janeway saw it coming, realizing that someone was attempting to assassinate the Kazon, possibly the Trabe, maybe her, and sabotage this alliance. That could have been anyone. She suspected the Kazon, but realized it was the Trabe when Mabus was attempting to get her and the other Federation personnel away from the room to have a little chat. Well, his fighter came down and killed all the Kazon First Mages in the room. Janeway, quite rightly, saw through this, warned the Kazon, and this destroyed any chance of the Kazon sects overcoming their differences and creating a lasting peace, or at least the beginnings of a lasting peace in this region, and a powerful stabilizing force. As Tuvok put it, once they got a taste of peace, maybe they'd like it. I'm paraphrasing him, of course, but that was basically his meaning. It could have led to a long-term sustainable peace and stability within the region. The Kazon could have become a force for good with the Trabe's help, but instead they took advantage and did exactly what they did in the past and tried to simply kill the Kazon because they saw them as violent savages, and that's all they understood. As Janeway pointed out, it seems more likely that it was actually all the Trabe understood was violence. And this, of course, broke the alliance down immediately, and Voyager had to get out of there before the Kazon were able to retaliate, as probably did the Trabe. This was the last we saw of the Trabe, and it's not entirely clear what's happened to them, but it's very likely after this, it will have deepened the hatred and the rift between the Trabe and the Kazon and intensified the Kazon's attempts to probably continue to wipe out the Trabe. And quite frankly, unless some miracle happened and the Trabe managed to either get out of the area completely, or gain an ally, or actually learn their lesson maybe, it's probable that that's the likely outcome of their continued antagonization of the Kazon in this regard. It had been approximately the year 2346 when Jal Senkur, the grandfather of Maj Kullah, had united the sects and defeated the Trabe in the first place. Despite them saying, well, 30 years, why they not got over it, clearly the Trabe hadn't learned anything in 30 years either. And that is just kind of speaks volumes for this entire region. This was a race who'd been on the run, had been harried and harassed and attacked for decades, but yet was still not able to realize that they were basically facing their own karma. They had brought this on themselves. They made their own worst enemy in the Kazon. Now, I'm going to address a couple of observational points. One of them is actually just this. What exactly was Voyager firing at that Trabe fighter? Trabe technology is likely slightly inferior to Kazon, because the Kazon have been enhancing the tactical side of their technology for years, whereas the Trabe, considering their displaced nature, have not been in a position to really advance their technology, and likely it wasn't as militaristic in the first place as what the Kazon turned it into. So there's that. This was merely a Kazon fighter. We see a shuttle can overpower with a couple of phaser strikes. What did Voyager fire at this thing and hit 3 times? Because it wasn't photon torpedoes to just splat on the surface of its shields, the shuttle survive it and fly away. I don't buy the photon torpedoes could be made weak enough to explode to such a low degree. So comment down below exactly what did Voyager fire. Secondly, my theory about the Kazon, I believe strongly that the Kazon would have been used as a workforce by the Trabe, and that explains their familiarity with engineering, science, and technology, because they would have had to be educated in order to work the ships, in order to operate them. And also, the Kazon were able to adapt even to Federation technology and repair it. That's a technology should be far beyond them. This indicates, again, learning and adaptability amongst the Kazon that's not obviously apparent when you think of them as just mindless savages. And the next one, this one is going to be an open debate. Did the Kazon and the Trabe share the same homeworld? Because I'm not entirely sure. I can't find any canonical source, but I don't actually think they did. It seems logical that they would, like the Trabe simply annexed an inferior race, for lack of a better term, as they would have seen it on their homeworld, a less developed civilization. A bit like the Kazon being a Neanderthal to the Trabe's Homo sapien. Not as developed and had lost out in the evolutionary war. But if that was the case, they wouldn't have had a need to encourage the infighting. They wouldn't have had a need to do any of that. It was like those were imposed values. They would have risen up long before this. There would have been history of challenges and other things between them. There would have been much more history. It seems infinitely more likely that the Trabe found the Kazon, likely an underdeveloped civilization. If they were spacefaring at all, they weren't as advanced as the Trabe. They were either defeated in a war or they were simply invaded as a pre-warp civilization and then enslaved by the Trabe. Which then does bring to the question, did the Trabe maintain a presence on the Kazon's homeworld or not? Do the Kazon even know where their original homeworld is? And the theory of the Kazon being somewhat nomadic could have a degree of truth behind it, because the Kazon simply don't know. I don't think that's true. I think they do know where their homeworld is. I think the Trabe annexed it and invaded it and conquered it, and I think they took Kazon off-world and put them to work at various Trabe colonies and outposts and shipyards. That's what I think happened. But let me know in the comments section below if you have an alternative theory as to the complicated history between them. Because there is another school of thought that if the Trabe were that way inclined, they would have done it to other races perhaps, or perhaps it was enough of their resources to maintain control of the Kazon. So similar to the Cardassians, who technically invaded Bajor and seemed like a great big power, they bit off more than they can chew, and the Cardassian military spent all of its effort and resources trying to occupy Bajor and simply didn't have the time to occupy and oppress other regions. The Trabe could have been similar, and not having the wider resources to actually maintain and oppress another civilization in addition to the Kazon. So, there is that theory. But again, that is the Trabe in brief. Let me know in the comment section down below your thoughts on them, and if you made it all the way to the end of this video, I thank you for watching. Bye-bye.